Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Handoff. If you're watching this video and you haven't watched part 1 of my 2-part Figma tutorial, check out the link below or click on the card at the upper right hand side of this video screen. So in part 2, we'll be starting where we left off last time and also cover some more advanced topics associated with Figma. By the end of this video, you'll be able to create your first frames, groups, and components, and we'll also cover creating grids in Figma as well. We'll end with creating your first interactive prototype and prepare your designs for handoff to development. So let's get started. So last time we talked about creating different shapes using the shape tool. So coming in here, creating rectangles, creating circles, and also creating other polygons as well. Something I want to also note that I forgot to mention in my last video is that as you're creating any of these items, so for example, a rectangle, you'll be able to hold down the shift key to make sure that the constraints of your X and Y dimensions, so the width and the height, are going to stay static. If you don't do that and you just click the R button and start dragging, you'll see that you have more fluidity in whether you want it to be wider or shorter. But if you hold down shift while you're doing this dragging, you'll actually be able to make sure that you'll get a perfect square or a perfect circle instead of an ellipse every single time. So that's a really good feature to take note of. Aside from that, what we're going to talk about today is the concept of groups versus frames. So something that you might be doing pretty commonly in Figma is if you have two different elements and you want to be able to move them in conjunction. So if you have two or more elements, or if you have a variety of different components or elements in here in Figma, you might want to group all 4 of these items so that they're grouped together and you can move them at the same time. So this is a very similar functionality that you have in Google Slides if you're using Sketch, or even XD, if you're coming from Photoshop. A lot of apps have this ability to group items. So what you're going to do is select all of the items that you want grouped. So in this case, I want to select the 2 squares I just created, the ellipse, actually, so 3 squares and the ellipse. I'm going to right click. There's actually the ability for you to group the selection. So this is going to create a group for me in the left-hand layers panel here. And what's going to happen is if I don't click on anything and I select the group, I can move this around, and it's going to move around all 4 elements at the same time for me. So in a lot of websites, in this particular case, I'm going to take the Google logo and I'm going to drop and drag it here just for reference. You're going to be wanting to group different items that combine to create one larger item. So in the case, if I wanted to come in here and recreate the Google logo, for example, I'm going to start using Product Sans here, which is the font that Google uses for their new logo. I am just going to make this a little bigger, so maybe 160 or so. And then I'm just going to try to mirror this as closely as possible. And remember, we can use the Control-C button to use the eyedropper tool to figure out whether or not we can copy the color of this over into the letter that we just copied over, so the G. I'm going to do the same for the next 2 O's. So Google, I'm just going to do this really quickly. So I know that the last E here in Google actually has the little slant. I'm not going to go ahead and do this in that particular case, but what you're going to want to do here is that you'll see that in our canvas area that each one of the letters in the Google logo is now separated. So if we wanted to combine them, what we would do is use the group in order to do that. So we would right click and click group selection, or we would use the tool the keyboard shortcut Command G, or if you're on a Windows, Control G to group all of these items. So now I can rename this entire group to Google. So this is a really powerful tool that I definitely recommend all entry-level designers start to get familiar with as they learn any sort of tool like this, because it's going to make your life a lot easier in the layers panel here instead of having to navigate hundreds of different layers for the same set of items. So it would be a headache if you realized you had multiple Google elements and then you had to figure out which one corresponded to what. So you don't know which G here in this particular case maps to which logo that you have. So finding a way to group all of these items is going to be super useful for you. So we talked about groups just now. We introduced this concept where you want to group related items together. In the case where you want to create a frame, this is another similar concept that Figma has, that in other apps such as Sketch and XD you might be referring to as an artboard. So the main difference here between a group and a frame is that if you're creating elements in a frame, what's going to happen is that as you start scaling the items in that group, you're going to find that the items within the frame do not scale, whereas the items within a group will. You'll find here that each one of the logos in the Google logo is actually a font, or it's a particular letter that I've created in using the text tool here. So what I would want to do is actually to come in here and outline the stroke. So what this does is converts each one of the letters in here into a stroke that I can actually come in here and manipulate. So I'll see each one of the different points that composes each one of the letters in the Google logo. And I'm just doing this to illustrate what's happening here as I have a group versus when I have a frame. So in this particular case, I'm going to delete this now, and I'm also going to delete this group for simplicity. On the left here, we have our Google group, and on Google group. And on the right here, we actually have the Google frame. So what you can do here is you can ungroup all of the items, and then you can right click and click frame selection. So that's going to create a frame instead. And you'll see that this is denoted because the group has this little dotted square, whereas the frame has more of this checkered pattern. So that's the first difference in the layers panel if you want to see the difference between a frame and a group. The thing that I'm going to highlight here is that you can also access the frame. If you're coming in here and you're swapping between the frame and the group item here, you'll see that there's a bunch of other items that we'll get to, but at its most basic core, you get to choose between a frame and a group. So when I click on the group, what happens as I start scaling is that the dimensions of whatever's in it start scaling with my cursor. So as I start dragging it super wide, each one of the items in the Google font, so each one of the letters starts scaling with it. I'm going to revert that back. And then in the case where I'm selecting my frame, you'll see that I can actually select individual items in the frame. So as I can go in here and actually select a partial selection of just the letters, just the double O. Whereas if I'm choosing the group, I don't get the chance to do that because this is considered part of that higher level grouping of elements. Whereas a frame still has each one of the elements individually selectable, but the frame itself does not scale. So in this particular case, if I'm coming in here and I start dragging the bottom right hand corner, you'll see that the Google item does not scale as I start dragging the frame horizontally or vertically like the group does. And the reason for that is because when you're coming in here and you want to select each one of the items, you'll see that this was a concept that we had talked about briefly in the last video that we didn't get to, but this is the concept of constraints. So constraints in this particular case, if you have an element inside of a frame, what's going to happen is that you can define where this item is going to live in relation to the frame itself. So in this particular case, we're constraining this item to the left side of the frame, and we're also constraining it to the top of the frame. So if we're able to apply a background here, I'm just going to do that. I'm going to apply a white background to the frame itself. What each one of these letters is constrained to is this little area up here at the upper left hand corner, because we specified that we want it to be constrained to the top and to the left. So it's not going to move as we start scaling because all of these items are fixed to the upper left. So the O in this particular case, the X coordinate of 128.56 and the Y coordinate of 36.16, that's constrained in relation to the upper left hand corner. What you see here is if I start selecting all 6 of these items, each one of these letters in the Google font, and I start choosing top and right, what's going to happen is this is going to stay fixed to the upper right hand corner. So if I click the frame in this case, you'll see that it starts staying fixed to the upper right hand corner. So this is a really powerful tool that groups don't allow you to do. Whereas groups, you can have them stay fixed as an entire item as a whole, so you can move this around as you want, but you won't be able to specify where it lives in relation to another element unless it's inside a frame. So the cool part is that within a frame, you can actually start grouping items too. So if I wanted, for example, the G to be to stay fixed to the upper left, and each one of these letters to stay to the upper right, I can do that using the constraint element here. But what I can also do is I can come in here, I can select all of the items and group them. So now I have a Google group within a frame. And that's a really cool concept if you anticipate having shared elements such as a navigation bar, or if you have a footer or something that's going to stay static on every single page, you can move those items in relation to the frame itself. And this is how a lot of people get that fixed layout, and they can make sure that their navigation bar stays fixed to the very top or to the very bottom of the page. They can also have some other items stay static as well, and that's a really cool way to show that off. Great, so we just talked about the concept of a group and a frame in Figma. The next topic I want to cover here is if you're coming in here and designing an app or a website or something else using Figma as a digital prototyping or wireframing tool, you want to figure out what type of dimension and also what type of design you want to create. So every design that you're going to create is going to be embedded within this thing called a frame that we just covered. Frames can be predefined, and they can have specific widths and heights that are predetermined so that you can work off of them. So a cool way to do this here is if I came down here and clicked the frame element, you can actually see all of the possibilities for a mobile, tablet, desktop, and a variety of other possibilities if you want to design maybe a LinkedIn banner, or if you wanted an A4 paper design. There's a lot of different things that you can do here, and you can get to that by clicking the F button, or you can click the A button on your keyboard. Either one is fine. A just maps to artboard, so if you're familiar coming from Sketch or XD, that's another thing that you can do. So in this particular case, if I'm coming in here and I know that I want to design for an iPhone 11 and I click on that, it's going to create a frame for me automatically. But you'll realize that this frame, just like many others, it can be renamed. So if I came in here and I wanted to rename our previous frame from frame 1 to Google frame, I can come in here and do that. You can do the same thing with any group or anything else that you have here in the layers panel. Just note that when you're hovering over any of these layers here on the left, you might have a lock button or the little I button here. And I'll quickly explain what these two do, because sometimes you'll find that you accidentally click on them and you can't move on anything, or something disappeared. So what you're going to do with the lock item is that if you plan on not moving this item ever again in relation to everything else that's on your canvas, or even a group within it, you can actually lock that item. You'll see that I won't be able to move it around anymore. So I'm actually clicking on the frame and I'm not able to move it around. That's because it's fixed, it's locked. So that's this tool here where you have the lock and unlock button. So you can get to that by clicking the lock button, or you can do a Command L to lock it or a Command Shift L to unlock it. You can also do the same thing with the hide. So if I clicked on this little I button here, you'll see that this lowers its transparency, and then ultimately the frame itself disappears from my view because it's hidden from your canvas. So those are two things to note. But coming back here to our iPhone 11 frame that we just added, you'll see that it automatically spits out this 400 by 414 by 896 artboard for us in terms of its width and its height. And that's predetermined for every single device that they've come in here and created for us, which is a huge time saver, where in the past you would have to manually specify your dimensions, where now you just need to figure out what type of device that you're designing for. And the other cool thing here is that you can actually have the ability to just swap whether you want it in portrait or landscape mode. So if you're designing for landscape, you can have the ability to flip the phone, and also for portrait, you can have it vertically as well. So with that, let's actually come in here and start designing some common elements, and you can start to get a feel for what we're going to be doing with groups and frames here. So within a frame, within this particular frame, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start creating a placeholder for maybe a top navigation button. So this is just going to be a very light gray top section here, and you remember from our last video that you can actually change the background of the canvas itself. So if I wanted to change this to maybe like a darker black or something, you'll see that I can actually see my frames a lot better now on this particular canvas. So we have our little light gray nav bar here. We can create a quick hamburger menu. So I'm just using rectangles to do this right now, but there's a lot of great sites for you to actually find a lot of these items online so that you don't have to create them from scratch. We'll assume that we're just going to add a quick logo here. I'm going to turn this into, how about 56? So a quick logo here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just also going to create 3 navigational elements here at the very bottom. So same little gray color. So using the eyedropper, the Control C tool to come in here and just create 3 really quick variants of what we're going to potentially see. So this is going to be item 1, like this 24. So item 1, I'm going to center all of these items here as well. Item 2, and then item 3. So now what you essentially want to do is within your frame, you'll see that I have all of these different layers now. And I want to find some way to organize them because I plan on using these across different screens. So maybe this is going to be your home page. You might have another screen. So I actually just copy pasted this onto the canvas itself. So it makes another copy. I'm going to come in here and actually rename each one of these items as well. So home, and maybe this is going to be the item 1 page. So that's the navigation at the very bottom where I want that highlighted. So the cool thing that we're going to cover here is that we can come in here and start grouping elements. So at the very top, I'm going to group the hamburger menu. So I might want to group the hamburger menu as separate. So I'm going to select those 3 rectangle first. So selecting these 3 rectangles and clicking the group button or the Command G button is going to create a group. So I'm going to name this hamburger menu. For our logo, we already have the text there, and then we want the rectangle in the background. So each one of these 3 items, if we copy all of them and group them, we'll now have a group here that we're just going to call navbar in this particular case. Coming down here, we'll also want to do the same with our navigation bar. So in this particular case, this is actually going to be the top bar, not the nav bar, and this is going to be the bottom navigation bar. So in this particular case, I'm actually going to group each one of these combinations. So group 1, group 2, and then group 3, and then you have your little background. So I'm going to combine all of these elements and then call this navigation bar at the bottom. So you're going to have these groups on every single one of your screens because you plan on having the navigation bar and the top bar stay consistent regardless of which page you're on. And the cool thing that you can look at here now is that we have groups inside our frame. So this is the same thing that we did here with the Google logo inside the Google frame. But one cool thing that I want to note here is that you can actually create a component if you ever plan on changing or creating different variants of your same group on every single one of your pages. So in this particular case, if we anticipate that we're going to have this navigation bar and this top bar on every single page and that you anticipate making changes to it in the future. For example, if I came in here, I knew that I was going to have a page for item 2, and then we knew that we're going to come in here and have another page for item 3. What you're going to want to do is actually make sure that you're pulling these items out of your artboards or your frames here, and then making sure that they're living alone. And you'll see the power of this in just a second. But I'm actually just going to reorganize my layers here on the left really quickly. So you'll see that we had our Google frame on the left here. I'm going to delete that, and our Google group. In this particular case, we have 4 frames. So home, item 1, item 2, item 3. And then now I just pulled these 2 groups out of these 4 screens. And the reason why I'm doing that is because in the case that I realize, oh no, the gray for the hamburger menu here is actually too light to be seen on the gray background here. And that's something you always want to check as a designer, is making sure that the color contrast is high enough so that people with visual impairments and disabilities can see them. I'm going to come in here and just make sure that the hamburger menu is actually just set to black. And then you'll realize that if I zoom out, you'll see that that change isn't set to each one of these other 3 screens I just created. And you'll realize, oh shoot, that's going to be a huge headache if I have to come in here and change it for every single screen that I just created this top navigation bar for. But the cool thing is that if I start pulling some of these items out into their own sections, what you can do is create this thing called a component. So coming in here to the top bar, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the hamburger menu, and I'm going to apply that black fill to it again. So this is the same thing I just did here on the home screen. But what I'm going to do here is that instead of making this a group, I'm actually going to right click, and then there's a button here that actually says create component. So by default, you'll see that in the left-hand side panel here, this automatically changes the color from black to purple. And in addition, the icon here for the group changes from the group or the frame into what we call a symbol or a component here. So if you're using Sketch or XD, this is actually called a symbol. In this particular case, where we call it a component in Figma. And a component, if you're familiar with atomic design or some of these other principles where you're essentially starting from these smaller building blocks and then building your way up to more complex items, is that you're creating this once and then you can reuse this item over and over again in different screens. So in this particular case, I'm going to copy this. So I just click Command C, you can right click and copy it. What I'm going to do here is copy it, and then I'm going to replace every single one of these logos with that variant of the top navigation bar that I just created. So I copied this. I am going to paste it and make sure that it stays fixed to the very top. So the cool part about this now is that if I came in here to this main component, and you'll see that each one of the components that I have, you'll see that instead of what we have here at the very top with this little diamond shape that has the 4 little dots, we actually have a unfilled diamond. And what that means is that this is a copy of the parent item. So this is essentially the OG or the original version of the component that we just created, and each one of these is a copy. So this is the parent item. You can think of these as the parent's children. So what's going to happen is if I make any sort of change to this top parent item, every single instance of its children element or every single copy is going to inherit or copy those same changes that I make to the parent item. So for example, if I came back in here to the hamburger menu and I realized instead of black that I wanted it to be a nicer color, maybe a dark blue or something, you'll see that on every single one of the screens, it updates it automatically. So that's a really powerful way to create these components and making sure that you're doing things once so that you don't have to do them and make those changes and copy them from screen to screen. I'll come in here and quickly do the same for our navigation bar here. But there's one additional thing that I want to highlight is this thing that Figma released recently called variants. So in addition to creating a component here for the navigation bar and then copying it into every single page, I'm going to do that first, and then I'll show you exactly what a variant is going to be able to allow us to do. So now we have an example here where on each one of these 4 screens, or home, item 1, item 2, and item 3 screens, we have an instance of this navigation bar. So we've copied this parent item, we've copied this parent item into each one of these screens, so that if we came in here and decided to change this from item 1 to item A and item 2 to item B, and then also item 3 to item C, you can see that those changes permeate and show up on every single version of these screens that I had just created. So this is a really, really powerful way to do that. But you'll realize that in most apps, if you're coming in here and you're on the item A page or on the item B page, and then I'm also just going to quickly rename the last one as well, the item C page, you're going to realize that typically you're going to have the navigation item at the very bottom filled in so that you know which one is active. So the thing that you're going to want to do here is you're going to want to instead, in addition to making a component, you want to create different variants. So in addition to creating a component, you're also going to want to create different variants of that same component. So the navigation bar that we just created, you'll see that within the right-hand section, there's a few different new items that you can add here. So a description link, which allows you to add a description to the navigation bar so that people coming in here know what it's going to be for. There's also a way for you to link out to a documentation link. So if you have a design system or you have maybe another document that explains what this particular component is going to be used for, you can use that. So that's a really powerful way to make sure that your developers and your designers are staying in sync. But the thing I want to highlight here is that within the navigation bar, what you're going to want to do is click on this variants button here. So this by default creates a variant for you. So it creates another copy here. But this variant, what it does is that you can specify all of the different possible variations or possibilities that are going to take this parent item and make some sort of quick modification to it. So in this particular case, I want the first item to be filled in. So I'm just going to call this item A filled in. And what I'm going to want to do with this item is I'm actually going to take the little circle here and make sure that it's black. So this just denotes that this is an active version of item A, I'm going to come in here and then also make another variant. So coming in here, I'm going to create another variant, which is going to allow me to make item B the active item. And one more time, we're going to do this again for item C. So if I came in here and created another variant, I'm going to come in here and make this black as well, just to make sure that we are consistent and we have all 4 possibilities. So one more thing that we're going to want to do before we actually go in here and change all of the screens is that within our navigation bar, we want to make sure that they're renamed accordingly. So in this particular case, for the item B item, we're just going to call this item B filled in. And then we're going to do the same for this one. And this is just to make sure that you're naming them consistently, so that when you're actually changing each one of the variants here, you know exactly which one you're going to change it to. So on the home screen, we're going to keep this one the default. So in order from top to bottom, this is called default. This is called item A filled in, item B filled in, and item C filled in. So on the page where you have your item A, you're going to come in here and then change the drop down from item A to from default to item A. So this automatically turns the active item into item A. You can come in here and specify for the other 2 items as well. So that's a really powerful way to manage different variations of the same component that you're going to be creating. This is something that's super useful if you're creating buttons. Maybe you might have a different hover state or focus state. You might have different variations of a tab bar. There's a lot of different things that you can do in here. So this is a really powerful way to take advantage of that. So with that, now we have 4 different frames of an app that we're going to be building. So the last 2 things I want to cover here as I start spacing each one of these elements out is the concept of prototyping. So to illustrate prototyping, I'm just going to come in here and showcase what's going to happen on each one of these screens, and give you a taste of what each one of these screens is going to look like once you have everything ready and set up to prototype. So to give a refresher on what prototyping is, what you're doing with a prototype is communicating the value and interactive flows of what's going to happen as a user clicks on certain elements or interactive elements on your screens. So in this particular case, this is our home screen. This is our item A screen, our item B screen, and our item C screen. So assume that we want to be able to access each one of the other screens from this particular page. The way that you might want to do this is create some sort of home button for all of the pages A, B, and C that currently don't have any sort of interaction that allows a user to get back to the home page. But from the home page, you can click on item A, item B, or item C here at the very bottom to get to some of these other pages that you see here. So the first thing I'm going to do is create some sort of home button to allow a user to go home. So the first thing that I'm going to do is actually make sure that there's a home button here in the upper right hand corner of my top navigation bar. So within our top bar here, I'm actually just going to copy and paste this little home button. And I know it's huge, it's ugly, but for the sake of this demo, let's actually roll with it. So you'll see that copying it into this component actually saves me so much time, because you can see that that home button is now copied in every single one of these screens. So what we're going to do here is that we want to make sure that this home button is going to bring us back to the home page, and then each one of these buttons down here is going to bring us to the corresponding page on, or to the corresponding screen here. So we have home, item A, item B, and item C. So in this particular case, what we're going to do is actually click on the prototype button up here on the right. And you'll see that automatically we have different settings and different possibilities for selections here. And we first of all want to select which frame is going to allow us to start. But before we do that, we have to choose what type of device that we're going to be prototyping on. So if you remember when we're actually creating our frame, if I clicked on the A button, this was the one that I chose, the iPhone 11 Pro Max. So if I came into prototype, what I'm going to do is, first of all, click on any one of these items. You'll see that as I click into the prototype tab and have nothing selected, it actually allows me to choose my device type. So in this particular case, I'm going to just go with the device type that I had chosen. It doesn't matter what mode or model you're choosing. It's just going to change the look and feel of your actual prototype when you're demoing, which is kind of cool. And you can also specify the background when you're doing the demo as well. But what I'm going to do here is make sure that this is going to be my starting frame. So in order to do that, I want to make sure that I have a link to start with. So in this particular case, the home button, we don't need to link the home button back to the home button because we're on the home page, whereas we want each one of these groups down here to bring us to the corresponding pages. So I could either do it like this, where I link each one of the different groups, so item A to the item A page. But the better way to do this is make sure that within your navigation bar and your components up here that you're doing the same thing that you have up here. So in this particular case, the item A button is actually going to bring me to the item A page. The item B group is actually going to bring me to the item B group, and then so forward. And you'll realize that you're going to have to do this for all the other ones, because in this particular case, when I was making the variants, I didn't have these links created for me by default. But you'll see that what happens here is that as I create the links for the top level components, it automatically adds links in all of the children elements as well. So that's a really good way to make sure that all of your stuff is in sync. So I'm going to quickly fast forward through this next part, because I'm going to be adding the links for all of these other items so that you can see what's going on. But now we're back, and you'll see that we have a bunch of different links here. So if we wanted to see where we could go from the home page, I'm going to click on the frame here. You'll see that I can only get to item A, B, and C, whereas from the item A page, I can currently only get to B and C. And we'll want to make sure that this top logo is also linked as well. So clicking on the home icon here, and then making sure that that goes back to the home page. So you'll see that in each one of the other frames here, we can now get back to the home page and to the other two pages that are currently not linked. So what's going to be really cool here is that coming back to the prototype page, you'll see that we have all of the links established. So we can now choose the starting frame that we want to start with. So in this particular case, it already chooses home for me, which is really great. I can also start it at item A or item B if I want. That's up to you. But the cool thing about this is that as I click the play button, this is going to bring us into a new mode. So this is where you start presenting your prototype. And if you have different pages, so in this particular case, I only have one page, you can actually create different prototypes in every single one of those pages so that you can demo different parts of your app and make sure that they stay completely separate from each other. So I'm going to give this a second to load, and you'll see that automatically some certain things are going to be cut off because I forgot to account for the bezels at the very top for this particular prototype. But you'll see that from this particular page, I can get to the other pages. So clicking here will bring me to the item A page. Clicking here will bring me to the item B page, item C page, and at any point, if I want to go back to the home page, I'm just going to click on that button up here at the very top. So this is what we call by prototyping, and this is a good way to show your stakeholders or other people that you're working with exactly the flows and what you're doing inside your app and how people can navigate and get to other pages within your prototype. This is also really valuable for talking about this next part, where we're going to be talking about handoff and preparing your work for handoff so that when you're working with developers, you can communicate exactly what's going on and how they can extract some of the items and assets and styles and content as well from your app so that they can start building it. So coming back here, we're actually going to go back into the design tab, and you'll see that as of now, I'm going to remove the left-hand panel and the right-hand panel. You can do that by clicking the command period button. So command plus your period button is actually going to remove the left and right so that you have a little more space to work with. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to click on any one of these items. So in this particular case, let's go ahead and just click on the home button. Or on the home screen on the home text. So what your developer is going to be doing is that if you give them share access in this particular case, you can give anyone the ability to access this link. You can invite them to the file. As a developer, they're going to have to come in here and click on the inspect element. So this button on the right tells them all of the possible properties and items that they need to know in order to copy this or start working with it. So they can copy all of the content in here. They can take a look at the typography and figure out exactly what font you're using, whether you're using a bold, regular, or lightweight font, if there's any other sort of styling associated with this. They can also copy some of the CSS down here, and there's different ways for them to figure out exactly what format of styles that they need. So CSS for web versus iOS or Android styles, that's also really powerful. And then you can also view this information in a table format as well, depending on what format you want. But this is essentially the way that a developer would be looking at your designs and inspecting them for the possible possibilities or looking at it and inspecting your designs for seeing whether or not the styles are comprehensive enough for them to get started. But of course, they're going to definitely want and expect you to set up a meeting with them to make sure that you're walking them through the designs to begin with, and that you're not just handing them a bunch of random code that a program is spitting out. Especially because as a designer, a lot of this code is still very spaghetti in that it might not be super useful. So especially as a developer that's going to be coming in here, they don't want to see all this absolute positioning. They want to be able to figure out where this lives relative to other elements on your page, what happens if the page is super long or if people are accessing it on different devices. But this is a really good start for a developer to start working with whatever you have and making sure that it stays consistent and that they're able to understand what you're designing and how to translate that into a actual prototype or a functioning application that others can use. So with that, this concludes part 2 of the Figma tutorial. I hope this was a great intro, and if you have any questions, feel free to drop them down below in the comments. I really like sharing tutorials like this because as when I first started, I really didn't have any tutorials like this to guide me, but nowadays Figma is so big that it's great to be able to keep up to date with some of these new tools as they're coming out. But if you thought this was helpful, please drop a like and also subscribe. Feel free to connect with me on my LinkedIn or ask additional questions in the comments if you have anything else. But other than that, I'll see you in the next video.